Hello, everyone. First of all, I apologize for not being able to travel and be physically present at this magnificent conference. I am Omar Saldaña, a professor of the University of Barcelona in Spain. I am part of the Invictus Research Group, along with colleagues such as Álvaro Rodríguez-Carballeira, Emma Tello, Carolina Andana, and Almudena Tello. Our group has been studying violence in various interpersonal contexts, including coercive cults, for many years. This year, I have the pleasure of presenting a communication titled Towards a Model of Interpersonal Domination to Understand Violence Perpetrated in Close Relationships. I hope you find it interesting. In recent years, scientific evidence has accumulated on the elements that characterize different forms of interpersonal violence that can occur in intense, continuous, close relationships. The purpose of this communication is to present a theoretical model and to examine the similarities that exist between violence perpetrated in three different abusive contexts: abusive groups, intimate partner violence, and sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. The model I want to present to you encompasses four elements that might be useful to define these three forms of interpersonal violence, namely the power imbalance, the duration of the relationship, the abusive strategies, and the domination of the victims as the main objectives of such violence. Firstly, these forms of interpersonal violence involves a severe power imbalance within the relationship dynamics. In scientific literature, the term power imbalance refers to a situation in which there is an asymmetry in the distribution of power or decision-making within a relationship between two individuals. This asymmetry can manifest in different ways and can have a significant impact on the dynamics and health of the relationship. Power imbalance can be related to various aspects, such as control over economic resources, making important decisions, influence over activities and social relationships, level of autonomy, and communication within the relationship. In a relationship with a power imbalance, one party often has greater control or influence over these aspects, while the other party has less power and might feel subordinate or dependent. It is important to note that power imbalance does not necessarily imply an abusive or coercive relationship. It can arise due to individual difference in personality, gender roles, negotiation skills, or socioeconomic circumstances. However, when the power imbalance becomes disproportionate or abusive, it can result in a dysfunctional and detrimental relationship to the health and well-being of the individuals involved. Research has shown that victims of interpersonal violence, rather than having a specific psychological profile, often find themselves in a situation of great vulnerability before entering the abusive relationship or the cultic group. On the one hand, in the case of members of abusive groups, some vulnerability factors that have been found include those inherent to the adolescents, having experienced stressful life events, difficulties in social adaptation, family disorganization, or certain psychological needs such as the need for affiliation, the search for purpose, and the need for spiritual or personal development. On the other hand, the majority of research regarding risk factors for child and adolescent sexual exploitation, victimization, has identified multiple vulnerabilities, including a lack of psychosocial maturity associated with a young age, family stories linked to abuse, neglect, and maltreatment, and contextual issues as poverty, running away, street situations, and migrations. Finally, women who are victims of intimate partner violence are often in a vulnerable situation. So of the vulnerability factors that research has identified include low self-esteem and lack of self-confidence, a history of previous victimization, economic dependency, social isolation, cultural or religious beliefs that justify familial submission, and pregnancy and parenting. As we have pointed out, victims of interpersonal violence often find themselves in a position of great vulnerability. In contrast, perpetrators tend to have a relatively high status, certain authority, and the capacity to bestow valuable things for the victims, such as glimpses of the truth, contact with the divine, money, food, drugs, housing, affection, or protection. As a result, perpetrators hold an overwhelming amount of power that can be exploited to control their victims, being the ones who make the final decisions about whether victims can access what they need and value. This power imbalance makes victims to be relatively unable to defend their own interests and to feel increasingly powerless, helpless, and even more vulnerable. Secondly, it has been argued that interaction recurrence and duration in time are key elements to understand interpersonal violence exerted in close relationships. In comparison to aggression, which is understood as an occasional action that harms the affected person, abuse is perpetrated on a continuous and systematic basis. Regarding violence perpetrated in abusive groups, research shows that members are generally affiliated with the group for a long period of time, and contact with other group members, including leaders or other figures of authority, is really frequent. For example, in the studies conducted by our research group, former members of abusive groups remained affiliated with the group for an average of 18 years. In a study conducted by Rosolet and colleagues, 23% of participants had daily or almost daily contact with the leader. The frequency of contact with the leader and other group members, whether in person or through new information and communication technologies, facilitates the development of an abusive relationship. Regarding child and adolescent sexual exploitation, some victims don't establish lasting relationships with any particular exploiter, but occasional contacts with multiple customers. However, in the vast majority of cases, there is an enduring abusive relationship that can last for years, whether with a pimp, a sex trafficker, a family member, other gang members, or a recurring customer. Regarding intimate partner violence, the frequency of interaction is often daily, especially when both members of the couple cohabit in the same household. Interaction recurrence allows the abusive process to be gradually intensified and fosters the normalization of the abusive situation by the victims. Thirdly, interpersonal violence in close relationships is characterized by the implementation of a wide range of psychological, sexual, and physical abusive strategies, which directly impact the victims by affecting their emotions, cognitions, and behavior, or indirectly by controlling their immediate environment. Our research group has developed different taxonomies where abusive strategies were identified, classified, and defined within various violent contexts. In this regard, we have created a taxonomy that includes 26 different strategies of psychological abuse that can occur in coercive cults. Another taxonomy with 20 strategies that can occur in the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. And third one, another taxonomy with 21 strategies of abuse that can occur in the partner. These taxonomies were developed through exhaustive literature reviews, and their content was validated using international expert panels. As you can see in the following slides, these three taxonomies have many parallels. In general, the taxonomies divide the abusive strategies based on whether they primarily affect emotions, cognitions, behaviors, or the immediate environment of the individuals who experience those strategies. This slide presents the strategies of emotional abuse that are included in the three taxonomies. As can be seen, the strategies of intimidation or threats, contempt, humiliation, or rejection, and manipulation of blame occur in all three contexts. And both close and intimate partners can involve self-interested activation of positive emotions. In the context of cults, we find three additional strategies, which are demands for affective and enthusiastic commitment, the group, induction to confessing deviant behavior, thoughts, and feelings, and granting of forgiveness. In the context of sexual exploitation, there is the strategy of affective enticement, which is defined as deliberately attempting to gain the children's trust and compliance through expression of positive affect, promises, and presence. In the context of intimate partner violence, two additional strategies are present. Contempt for roles is defined as disregarding or offending the reputation and dignity of the other person as a partner, as a caregiver and educator of the couple's children, or as a working professional. Disregard for the other person's emotions and ideas is defined as belittling or showing indifference to the other person's feelings, emotions, or ideas, even going so far as to forbid these expressions. This slide presents the strategies primarily aimed at manipulating the cognitions of the victims. This category has been labeled as indoctrination in an absolute and Manichaean belief system in the case of coercive cults, cognitive manipulation in the case of sexual exploitation, and imposition of one's own thinking in the case of intimate partner violence. As observed, it is in the case of coercive cults where more strategies of this typology can occur, including the negative reconstruction of the past and the previous identity, demands for full identification with the doctrine and its application, imposition of the doctrine above people and the law, glorification of the in-group and rejection of the out-group, and denigration of critical thinking, which is also applied in intimate partner violence. The remaining strategies, which can occur in either intimate partner violence, sexual exploitation, or in both contexts, are redefinition of reality, concealment and deception, construction of a new identity, and self-interested idealization of the bond of dependence. Obviously, in group context, this type of strategies are also frequently used. Although in the taxonomy of psychological abuse in group context, they have a more specific name or fall into another category. The third category relates to strategies that directly impact the victim's behavior. This category has been labeled as imposition of a single and extraordinary authority in the case of coercive cults, behavior domination in the case of sexual exploitation, and imposition of a subservient role in the case of intimate partner violence. In the context of sexual exploitation, strategies involving physical and sexual violence are included in this category, such as sexual imposition, which implies sexually objectifying the children's bodies and engaging them in sexual activity with the exploiter, and also instrumentation of sexuality, which involves engaging the children in sexual activities with third parties from which the exploiter gains profit, and also physical abuse. This does not imply that these types of strategies cannot occur in cults or intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, they do occur with a high frequency. The next three categories refer to strategies that impact the immediate context of the victim. The first one is isolation, which includes strategies to distance the victim from their family, friends, social support network, work, or studies, and also from their interests and hobbies. We also find strategies with different nuances in each abusive context that involve distancing the victim from their home, or in the case of intimate partnerships, confining the victim within the home. Finally, in the context of sexual exploitation, we have the strategy of restriction of access to goods and services, which involves limiting or preventing the children's access to goods, services, and relevant institutions, such as medication, personal hygiene products, healthcare, social care, legal system, or their official documents. The next strategy refers to how information is managed and manipulated. As we have seen earlier, in the case of sexual exploitation, such behaviors were included under cognitive manipulation within the strategy of concealment and deception. In group context, the strategy of manipulation of language stands out, which involves the use of common terms and the creation of neologisms, giving them a new meaning that acquires intense emotional and ideological significance for the group. In intimate partner violence, the strategy of concealing abuse is notable, which involves forcing the other person to keep silent about the abuse and forbidding any attempt to seek outside help. This strategy, obviously, would also occur in the context of sexual exploitation, especially when the child is aware of being a victim. The last category refers to strategies aimed at controlling the personal lives of the victims. We find three strategies that, although with slightly different names, are included in the three taxonomies. These are economic exploitation, control over activities and use of time, and control weakening of physical and mental health. As for the rest of the strategies, in abusive groups, the control of self-existence stands out, which involves convincing the individual to delegate decision about their existence to the group. In the case of sexual exploitation, the control over family or caregivers is notable, which involves manipulating the children's family or caregivers to compel them to cover up, accept, or even facilitate the exploited situation. Finally, as you can see, sexual coercion is included in this category within the context of intimate partner violence. As you have seen, all these abusive strategies, not only this category, but all the strategies that we have defined, might be explicit but also subtle, especially in the recruitment process in which perpetrators may present themselves as empathetic and compassionate people, making fraudulent promises of love, safety, and attention. In this regard, abusive behaviors might go unnoticed, and victims might have many difficulties in detecting exploitative motives and withstanding manipulation. It is important to emphasize that the synergies that are created among the previous strategies, and that they can be employed in varying numbers, frequencies, and intensity depending on the specific tactics used by perpetrators. Additionally, these strategies are often employed intermittently with positive interactions, facilitating the creation of trauma bonding. The final element of the model I am presenting relates to the objective pursued by violence in this interpersonal context. The primary goal of interpersonal violence in close relationships is to obtain submission and a broad dominance over the lives of the victims, rather than to cause damage or simply obtain obedience to specific orders. This objective makes abuse perpetrated in cultic groups similar to abuse inflicted in sexual exploitation or intimate partner violence, and sets it apart from violence exerted in other contexts, such as bullying or bullying at school or in the workplace, where the main goal is the exclusion of the individual. For perpetrators, domination may produce satisfaction associated to the achievement of power, as well as other benefits related to the labor, economic, or sexual exploitation of the victims. I will conclude this presentation by briefly highlighting some conclusions. As has been observed, there are significant parallels in the violence exercised in abusive groups, the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents, and violence in intimate relationships. In fact, in some cases, these three types of violence can intersect, as certain abusive groups combine violence within the group with experiences of sexual exploitation and or violence in intimate relationships within the members of the group. Obviously, there are also significant differences among these three contexts. For example, in coercive cults, abusive behavior are usually carried out by different members, turning victims into perpetrators. This can also occur in the context of sexual exploitation, when some girls engage in abusive behaviors towards other girls under the control of the exploiter, creating group dynamics similar to those in coercive cults. Finally, it's important to emphasize the severe consequence that this type of violence has on victims, both in the short and in the long term. On the one hand, as we have discussed, a traumatic bond is formed between the victim and the perpetrator. This traumatic emotional connection leads the victim to experience both terror and positive feelings of obligation and gratitude towards the perpetrators. The victims may also feel fear and resistance when considering leaving the relationship. On the other hand, interpersonal violence commonly induces high levels of psychological and physical dependence, which, along with trauma bonding, explains why it's common for victims to deny the violence, assume responsibility, refuse to cooperate with law enforcement, and, in the case of sexual exploitation, attempt to escape from custody at the first opportunity to return to the exploiter. Furthermore, a growing body of evidence indicates that individuals who have experienced violence in intimate relationships suffer from a wide range of physical, psychological, and social adjustment problems, including severe physical injuries, somatization, identity problems, depression, anxiety, complex traumatic stress disorder, disassociation, deterioration of social fabric, and suicide. Despite the importance of these consequences, our research group believes that they should not be part of the elements that characterize this type of violence. In any case, the psychological, physical, and social distress that victims might experience is a phenomenon that should be evaluated independently of the abusive action itself. This is particularly relevant in the legal context, as from our perspective, the abusive action should be punishable regardless of the consequence that the victims might present or might not. In conclusion, a conceptual model that highlights the parallels between these forms of interpersonal violence might be useful for better understanding the phenomenon. I want to thank you for listening to this communication, and I hope you find it interesting. Bye.